Okay. Subcommittee will come to order. Before I have my opening statement, I'd like to take a moment of personal privilege. As many of you know, our chair of the Energy and Commerce Committee recently announced that she would be leaving Congress and leaving us. While we are extremely sad about that, we are happy for her. She has done an outstanding job, and I do not use that word lightly, and I do mean it sincerely. She has been a great mentor for me personally, and she's been a great leader of this committee and a great member of Congress, and we will miss her dearly, and we want to wish you all the best. And I want to recognize the ranking member now for his comments.
Well, Chair Rodgers, it's been a pleasure to work with you on this committee. As subcommittee chair at one time and now as ranker, recognize your desire to make positive change and to have worked with you in a very constructive way. I appreciate your 20 years of service. I haven't achieved that level yet, but so I can imagine how much effort that takes. And
Got to get this recorded. Come on.
yes, come on. This was getting recorded moment.
There you go.
Thank you. Well, just a big thank you, everyone. I do believe the best is yet to come. And as I think about this final year and all of the just impressive, passionate, just brilliant members and staff, all the staff of this committee, I know that this committee is in good hands with all of you. It has been a privilege, just such a privilege to lead this committee, chair this committee. When I got on the committee, I knew I would never become the chair because I wasn't going to stay in Congress this long. But, you know, things happen, the years go by, and what an honor for me to lead this committee with all of you. We've worked on a number of important issues together. And you know what? We're going to finish this year, and we're going to finish it strong, and there's more to be done. So I think we should go to work. Thank you very much. Okay. Everyone should go through this.
Okay, the chair now recognizes himself for an opening statement. Let me welcome the witnesses to this hearing on legislation to update the process under the Clean Air Act for setting and implementing national ambient air quality standards, NAAQS. The Clean Air Act requires the promulgation of NAAQS for six criteria. Air pollutants, sulfur dioxide, particulate matter, nitrogen dioxide, carbon monoxide, ozone, and lead. Under the current structure of the statute, EPA is required to review periodically the scientific data upon which the NAAQS are based and revise the standards if necessary to maintain an adequate margin of safety that is requested to protect public health. Today we will hear testimony and receive feedback on the Air Quality Standards Implementation Act of 2024. This discussion draft would update how the standards are reviewed and implemented and provide more clarity in the law to enable better control of harmful emissions like wildfire smoke. This hearing is one of the utmost importance to many districts across the country. Southeast Georgia, where I'm from, is poised for a manufacturing boom. Our favorable climate, access to ports, low electricity rates, and welcoming businesses environment have made it one of the best places to invest in the country. We are growing quickly. Billion-dollar manufacturing investments have been made, and further opportunities are quickly presenting themselves. In addition to these developing areas, we have legacy industries that are a backbone of our economy. Georgia is the #1 forestry state in the country, and according to the Georgia Forestry Commission, the industry provided over $1.5 billion in economic output to my district in 2022. These sectors are looking to grow, and while they grow, they are seeking to do it with the highest environmental standards in the world. However, actions like the Biden administration's recently finalized annual PM 2.5 standard threaten to slam the brakes on these investments and economic drivers. One of the main concerns is that because of the success of the Clean Air Act already, new standards are getting closer and closer to background levels. Because of this, even areas that meet the standard will not have enough room or headspace to allow for permitting new or expanded construction. This recent action by the EPA is counterproductive to our goals of onshoring supply chains and boosting American manufacturing. According to a report conducted by Oxford Economics, the EPA's recently finalized PM 2.5 standards will threaten up to $197.4 billion of economic activity and put nearly 1 million jobs at risk. We'll hear today about analysis of permitting from 36 different industries, including pharmaceuticals, paper and wood, and electric vehicle batteries. The analysis shows that the recently finalized PM 2.5 standard would result in the failure to permit nearly 80% of those projects. And these are industries that already control emissions to the highest standards. We learned in a hearing last fall that most of the PM 2.5 emissions do not even come from these sources. After 40 years, something is not working with our system to set and enforce standards. The Clean Air Act was not established to kill American productivity and prosperity. It was established to enhance our success. We must make practical reforms to ensure the NAAQS process works in a way that makes sense. It should reflect the experience of 40 years of implementing air quality standards. The discussion draft reflects some of the experience. Among other measures, it would provide more time to develop new standards while providing time for EPA and the states to focus on implementing standards. It ensures that state air pollution agencies responsible for and experts in implementing the standards have a larger voice in the process. It would make clear that wildfire and other exceptional events can be reliably excluded from compliance data, and it would make it easier to reduce wildfires and lower harmful pollution levels. I invite constructive comments from the panelists, both on PM 2.5 implementation challenges and what those indicate about the current process and how reforms may address those challenges. I should note that we sought to have EPA testify today, but EPA declined to attend at this point. We will continue to work with the agency, as we should, including examining the comments it supplied to our bill. We will also continue to work to get this right. America has the best environmental standards and wonderful economic potential. We will work to make sure this remains the case going forward. At this time, I will recognize the ranking member for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The Clean Air Act is the most successful environmental law in our nation's history. No one can deny that we have significantly reduced air pollution while growing our economy. According to EPA, between 1970 and 2019, aggregate emissions of common air pollutants dropped some 77%, while the U.S. gross domestic product grew 285%. And yet, in the past, my colleagues across the aisle have pointed to this progress as a reason why we should not worry about further protection of public health, rather than as a proof that the Clean Air Act is working incredibly well and as intended. Because despite the past 5 decades of success, according to the American Lung Association's 2023 State of the Air report, 1 in 3 Americans still live with unhealthy levels of air pollution. In my opinion, and in the opinions of many doctors, scientists, public health experts, and environmental organizations, there is much more work to do. The National Ambient Air Quality Standards, or NAAQS, are a critically important part of achieving clean air for all Americans. As we have discussed at previous hearings, the NAAQS are special, not only because these standards protect Americans from dangerous pollution like soot and smog, but because they are required by law to be based on the latest science to be protective of our health without consideration of costs. Last week, EPA finalized an updated standard for fine particulate matter. This is just the latest example of this law working exactly as intended. EPA's independent science advisors on the Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee, upon reviewing the latest scientific literature, determined that the previous standard was not health protective and recommended strengthening it. EPA had a public comment process and decided to lower the annual standard from 12 to 9 micrograms per cubic meter to provide increased health protection, consistent with the recommendations of EPA's science advisors. Moving forward, Americans will get to experience tremendous benefits from this rule. Most importantly, it will save lives, avoiding 4,500 premature deaths. It will also reduce healthcare costs from avoided hospital visits and asthma cases. I applaud EPA for following both the law and the science to strengthen the annual PM 2.5 standard. Unfortunately, the bill before us today would make updates like this one much more difficult. It would double the amount of time between reviews of standards. It would inject cost considerations and attainability into the standard-setting process. And with overly broad language, the bill would increase the number of events that may be considered exceptional. These provisions will drastically weaken what has been an incredibly effective public health law. We have proven time and time again that growing our economy and protecting public health are not at odds. Unfortunately, the proposal we are examining today does not share that view, and I cannot support legislation that would undermine the current process of setting health protective standards based on sound, updated science. The Clean Air Act is working effectively as intended. It continues to drive innovation, protect Americans' health, and enable economic growth. Rather than change course as proposed by the majority, we should embrace this law's success and look to build upon that tremendous history moving forward. I look forward to today's hearing and its discussion that will inspire all of us. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chair.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize the chair of the full committee, the aforementioned Chair Rodgers, for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For decades, America has been the best place to do business, and we have the best air quality in the world. We've led the world with some of the highest environmental standards. America has done more to lift people out of poverty, raise the standard of living, more than any other nation in the world. Unfortunately, that's all being threatened. The number one barrier to getting anything done today in the United States is permitting, and it currently takes 7 years on average. And unfortunately, rules like the EPA is proposing are going to make that much worse. Last week, the Biden administration EPA finalized a standard on fine particulate matter, or PM 2.5, a decision that is devastating for American manufacturing, people's livelihoods, and our economic leadership. This new rule goes way beyond the original congressional intent first laid out in the Clean Air Act, which stated goal says, quote, reasonable actions to promote, reasonable actions to limit or reduce emissions and pollution. The administration's process to develop this latest rule was rushed, lacked transparency, and failed to incorporate feedback from stakeholders across the country who will be impacted the hardest. With EPA's nearly 150 proposed major rules, this is just the latest example of President Biden's extreme agenda that's going to devastate our communities, as we'll hear today. The EPA's decision to finalize these unrealistic standards will have far-reaching consequences for our economy. The harm will extend to nearly every sector, including manufacturing, power, agriculture, construction, and forestry, jeopardize hundreds of billions of dollars in U.S. economic activity and millions of jobs, and make it nearly impossible to build new manufacturing facilities, making efforts to secure our supply chains and reduce our dependence on countries like China nearly impossible. By all measures, the nation's air quality has improved dramatically since the Clean Air Act was enacted, and current standards are improving quality even more. The EPA itself has concluded that the current standards are protective of public health and has reported that the total emissions of criteria air pollutants have dropped 73% since 1980. The data is clear. The U.S. air quality is the best in the world, and it's only getting better. Despite this progress, the Biden EPA is taking steps to introduce these new standards that are completely divorced from reality. Instead of more harmful regulations, what we need are reasonable solutions that appropriately balance protecting our environment while ensuring America continues its economic leadership. That's the approach that we've taken for decades, and it's worked. As our air gets cleaner, the Clean Air Act provisions were established decades ago when the air quality was much worse, and we need to revisit that. We learned in our September hearing that as new PM standards get closer to natural background levels, there's less room for traditional industrial sources to get permits or further cut their emissions. But the EPA's new stricter standards completely ignore this fact. Under those standards, permitting new economic development will be nearly impossible. This will severely hinder new manufacturing projects, including pulp and paper, steel, cement, the automotive sector, advanced batteries, and even pharmaceuticals. States will be forced to limit new economic activity for communities that need them most. Additionally, limits in current law prevent states from addressing other naturally occurring sources of pollution, such as wildfires. We must update air quality standards responsibly in a way that reflects reality. The discussion draft under consideration today will ensure that measures to implement health protections are realistic and balanced in their approach. It will enable more orderly and responsible requirements that states can actually implement. It will ensure regulators follow the law when considering how to promote healthy communities, taking into account things like adverse public health, welfare, social, economic, and energy impacts. It will also make it easier to reduce wildfire risk, something that's especially important in my home state of Washington. Protecting our environment and our economy are not mutually exclusive goals. But in order to achieve both, we must rethink how we address pollution levels that are outside our control. This discussion draft today is a starting point to maintain America's economic leadership and ensure public health. And I look forward to the discussion and yield back.
The gentlelady yields. The chair now recognizes the ranking member of the full committee, the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pallone, for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today we're examining a partisan Republican draft bill that would undermine core protections of the Clean Air Act. Republicans simply cannot help themselves. They continue to put corporate polluters over people. Since 1970, the Clean Air Act has directed the Environmental Protection Agency to set health-based air quality standards based solely on the latest science and medical evidence. The National Ambient Air Quality Standards, or NAAQS, essentially sets the level of pollution that is safe to breathe. These standards are the foundation of the Clean Air Act. They've been extremely effective for over 50 years in cleaning the air and protecting public health. Last week, the Biden EPA strengthened the NAAQS for fine particulate matter, also known as PM 2.5. Fine particulate matter poses serious and significant health risks to our communities every day, including increased rates of heart disease and respiratory impacts. Even short-term exposure for hours or days can cause aggravated asthma attacks, acute bronchitis, and increased susceptibility to respiratory infections. This pollution is dangerous, and Americans have a right to clean, safe air. And basically, I want to commend the Biden EPA for fighting to protect that right with a stronger health-based standard. Last week's announcement is a welcome return to pollution standards rooted in science. Under the new standard, we will see tremendous public health benefits of up to $46 billion in 2032 alone. EPA also projects the new standard will avoid 800,000 asthma attacks, nearly 300,000 lost workdays, and thousands of premature deaths. Now it's up to the states to develop plans to implement this more protective standard. Cost and technological feasibility are front and center in this planning. States have the flexibility to select the most efficient and cost-effective tools and measures to meet the standards. The track record of the structure has been remarkably successful. The air has gotten cleaner, the economy has continued to grow, and most importantly, public health has improved. But the Republican majority is not interested in the Clean Air Act's record of success. This Republican draft legislation is clearly a response to EPA's upholding its duty to protect communities across the country from dangerous air pollution like ozone and fine particulate matter. Today, I'm sure we'll hear fear-mongering about the phantom cost to industry imposed by any attempt to safeguard the health of Americans. Time and again, my Republican colleagues have claimed this draft proposal will not increase air pollution or undermine the public health protections currently found in the Clean Air Act, and they are clearly wrong. Anytime you alter the fundamental premise of the Clean Air Act that standards should be set to ensure the air is safe and healthy to breathe, you're making our air dirtier and undermining our public health. This Republican draft is a compilation of misguided handouts to corporate polluters, making it clear that they are only interested in finding loopholes for their friends at the expense of American families and workers. The draft would allow industry profits to override science in setting air quality standards, provide amnesty to new polluting facilities at the expense of existing ones, and remove incentives to cut pollution. It would also weaken and delay the fundamental protections in the law, virtually guaranteeing that people living in areas with poor air quality will continue to breathe unhealthy air. Now, our experience with the Clean Air Act tells us that we do not have to choose between the health of our communities and a healthy economy. We can and must have both. Instead of wasting the committee's time with this old proposal, we should be looking for ways to ensure EPA and the states have the resources necessary to continue to give every American clean, healthy air to breathe. This proposal is an attack on the health and safety of Americans, and that's why I oppose it. And that's why in previous Congresses I've opposed it and will continue to oppose it. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. Now for our witnesses. First of all, we have Mr. John Eunice, who is the Deputy Director of the Georgia Environmental Protection Division. Mr. Eunice, thank you for being here. He is also famous, ladies and gentlemen, for at the age of 19, he was elected to the Valdosta City Council as the youngest member ever. I just thought I would throw that in, John. Also, Mr. Christopher Netrum, Managing Vice President of Policy at the National Association of Manufacturers. Thank you for being here. Mr. Seth Johnson, the Senior Attorney at Earth Justice. And Mr. Paul Noe, the Vice President of Public Policy at the American Forestry and Paper Association. Thank all of you for being here. Mr. Eunice, you're recognized for 5 minutes for your opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Carter, Ranking Member Tonko, members of the committee. My name is John Eunice, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Georgia Environmental Protection Division. I'm here to discuss a crucial aspect of environmental regulation that affects all of us, the National Ambient Air Quality Standards and their impacts on state regulatory agencies. The establishment of the NAAQS has resulted in significant improvements of U.S. air quality. In Georgia, total emissions of air pollutants dropped by 68% from 1990 to 2022. During that same period, gross domestic product increased by 437%. It's a striking example of the positive impacts of the Clean Air Act. My presentation will focus on the Air Quality Standards Implementation Act of 2024 in conjunction with EPA's recent announcement regarding PM 2.5 standards. Georgia and other states have some concerns with the new PM 2.5 standards, and the proposed legislation poses some options that warrant discussion to help address them. First, EPA's decision to lower the attainment standard from 12 micrograms per cubic meter to 9 will have noticeable effects across the country. In Georgia, our state is in attainment with the existing PM 2.5 standard. However, according to a recent EPA report, 12 of Georgia's 14 metropolitan statistical areas have PM 2.5 levels currently exceeding the new EPA standard of 9. Those 12 MSAs include more than 90% of our state's population. If the standard holds, Georgia EPD will have to develop separate state implementation plans, or SIPs, for each MSA to bring those areas back into attainment. These plans are hundreds of pages long, require significant stakeholder input, and take years to develop. Compounding that problem is that traditional point sources of these emissions, such as power plants and industrial operations, have already been adequately controlled with technology advances, leaving state regulators with limited options for bringing non-attainment areas back into attainment. The proposed legislation would help states address non-attainment areas more quickly by requiring implementation guidance be issued concurrently with the issuance of any new rules, so states have an immediate understanding of how to come into attainment. Currently, new NAAQS standards go into effect once the rule becomes final. However, it may take EPA months or even years to release implementation guidance. Next, a variety of sources contribute to PM 2.5, but less than 20% of these sources fall under regulatory oversight of state agencies. The vast majority of contributors of PM 2.5 are unregulated or exceptional events, like road dust, agricultural operations, and wildfires, which penalizes many areas that will now be placed in non-attainment. The proposed legislation explicitly recognizes prescribed fires as exceptional events, which saves state regulators from burdensome reporting requirements and helps prevent even more significant air quality concerns by preventing catastrophic wildfires. Third, there will be resource and personnel challenges for state agencies to implement this rule. Federal funding to states that implement federal air standards such as NAAQS has been stagnant for years, even though EPA continues to develop stricter rules that states must then determine how to apply locally. Every time a federal standard like PM 2.5 tightens, the pressure on states to comply increases without additional resources. The legislation addresses this by extending the timelines for NAAQS reviews from 5 to 10 years, which would result in more stability for states. Currently, the 5-year reviews run so closely together, it seems as though as soon as one review ends, another review begins. Extending the timelines of reviews would allow better allocation of the limited federal resources states currently receive. Finally, this new rule takes PM 2.5 levels severely close to area background levels, which will likely pose difficulties for future economic development. In Georgia, we have experienced major economic growth over the past decade due to effective logistics and transportation corridors, efficient ports of entry, and a favorable tax and business climate. This new rule poses a serious threat to that continued growth. Population and economic growth in Georgia to this point has coincided with improvements in air quality. However, the proximity of this standard to background levels of PM 2.5 puts Georgia and other states in a situation that could result in a stagnation of economic growth because the new standard for attainment may not be achievable for many areas. In the last 3 years, Georgia had landed the 2 largest economic development projects in state history. Both of these projects happen to be electric vehicle manufacturing facilities that will employ more than 15,000 people combined. One of these facilities is in Chairman Carter's district. Had this rule been in effect during the recruitment process for both of these facilities, then they likely would have located elsewhere. The legislation provides a couple of provisions that could help address these concerns from arising in the future. It would allow the administrator to consider whether the recommended standard is actually attainable, and it would also increase the number of representatives from air pollution control agencies on the Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee. Both provisions would help states in the development of future NAAQS. In closing, I want to emphasize that Georgia EPD's mission is to protect public health and the environment, and we will not waver from that commitment. While I believe the PM 2.5 final rule is well-intentioned, it poses multiple challenges to agencies like Georgia EPD. There is likely room for balance in the NAAQS process moving forward, and this legislation proposes some intriguing ideas that could benefit states and the public. Thank you, Chairman Carter, for the opportunity. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Eunice. Mr. Netram?
Good morning, Chairman Carter, Ranking Member Tonko, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Chris Netram, and I'm the Managing Vice President of Policy at the National Association of Manufacturers. I appreciate the opportunity to testify on behalf of the manufacturing industry and the 13 million men and women who make things in America. Manufacturing supports communities, creates well-paying jobs, pioneers new technologies, and powers economic competitiveness, as well as American influence abroad. But manufacturers are facing a regulatory onslaught. The total cost of complying with existing federal regulations exceeds $3 trillion a year, including $350 billion just on manufacturing. The average manufacturer pays more than $29,000 per employee per year to comply with federal regulations, a figure that rises to $50,000 for small manufacturers. $50,000 per employee every single year. For a small company with 20 employees, that's $1 million a year that isn't spent on capital investment or R&D. The EPA's unworkable PM 2.5 standard is the latest piece of this regulatory onslaught. This new rule will make it much more difficult to create jobs and build advanced factories in the United States. That's because the new standard of 9 is in line with background levels of particulate matter in many parts of the country. In other words, the standard is now so low that companies will be expected to reduce their emissions below what naturally occurs. Making matters worse, most particulate matter comes from non-industrial sources. The vast majority of emissions come from sources like wildfires, controlled burns, crop dust, and unpaved roads. Industry accounts for less than 20% of all PM 2.5, yet the onus will fall on manufacturing to meet the EPA's unrealistic standard. In practice, hundreds of counties across the country could be forced into non-attainment. That means it will be extraordinarily difficult for them to attract manufacturing investment. Roads, bridges, factories, these important projects could be stalled if manufacturers can't get permits to build them. With a PM standard as low as 9, it will be virtually impossible for manufacturers to have any headroom, or headspace as the chairman called them, to allow for growth. Companies that want to invest in communities at or near non-attainment levels will be hard-pressed to guarantee that new shovels in the ground won't push them past the level of 9. And there will be an economic cost to this change. A recent NAM study analyzed a PM standard of 8, which is slightly more stringent than what was actually finalized by the EPA, and it found that our nation would lose up to $200 billion in economic activity and up to 1 million jobs. Moreover, the EPA's approach will directly undermine the President's commitment to manufacturing and Congress's important work to support manufacturing growth here at home. The bipartisan infrastructure law, the CHIPS and Science Act, tax reform, all of these bills were designed to spur investment, but unbalanced regulations and permitting delays threaten that progress. In addition, the EPA's actions make the U.S. a global outlier. Europe's current PM standard is 25. China's, to the extent it follows it, is 35. If we want the next manufacturing dollar to be spent in America rather than abroad, a standard of 9 makes us less competitive. That's why manufacturers urge Congress to act immediately. As a first step, Congress should pass a CRA overturning this rule. At the same time, however, Congress should reform the NACS process. The committee's discussion draft reflects a more tailored approach that would take multiple factors into consideration. For starters, the economic effect and impact on American competitiveness, in addition to public health. First, the draft would extend the EPA's review period to 10 years, providing states and businesses much-needed certainty. The draft would also allow the EPA to count wildfire mitigation as an exceptional event rather than holding manufacturers accountable for PM they simply can't control. And the draft would require the EPA to consider economic effects in its NACS analysis, allowing the agency to take a holistic view of its standards. These reforms reflect the tremendous progress we've made as a nation since the passage of the Clean Air Act. The U.S. has seen a 78% reduction in PM over the last 50 years, in large part due to manufacturers' investments in cleaner production. We're now at a point where industry contributes less than a fifth of all PM 2.5, far less than fires and dust that have absolutely nothing to do with manufacturing. In short, Congress must act to reverse this damaging decision and reform the NACS process. I'd like to thank the subcommittee for shining a light on the EPA's regulatory overreach, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Nettram. This time we recognize Mr. Seth Johnson for your opening statement.
Good morning, committee members, and thank you for inviting me to testify today. My name is Seth Johnson. I'm an attorney at Earth Justice in Washington, D.C. My written testimony makes 5 major points. 1, the Clean Air Act is a health-based, highly effective, and successful law. 2, more pollution reductions are still needed to realize the Clean Air Act's full promise, healthful air for all Americans. 3, doomsday claims about clean air standards are nothing new and lack merit. 4, the Air Quality Standards Implementation Act of 2024 would undermine the promise of the Clean Air Act and should not be enacted. 5, instead, we should ensure EPA and state air agencies have adequate resources and clear mandates to carry out their core missions, ensuring people everywhere in our country enjoy clean, healthy air. I'll summarize these points now. Everyone in this country is entitled to breathe clean, healthy air. That's the promise we made ourselves as Americans in 1970 and reaffirmed in 1977 and 1990 when overwhelming bipartisan majorities carefully and thoughtfully amended the Clean Air Act. We've made great strides toward keeping that promise. We must not waver from it. The Clean Air Act is a highly successful law. It's helped drive massive pollution reductions. These improvements in air quality have promoted the health and well-being of hundreds of millions of Americans. But work under the Act isn't done yet. Tens of millions are still waiting for the air to be safe and clean in their communities. Also, the harms from air pollution are often not evenly distributed. All too often, the communities who bear the brunt of harmful air pollution have been historically marginalized. These historical factors are unfortunately still with us. So, improving air quality doesn't just improve public health and the environment, it also makes important progress toward realizing justice. This work took a big step forward recently when EPA finalized a landmark update strengthening the annual healthy air standard for fine particulate matter, or soot. Soot kills people. It also causes or is likely to cause many other serious health harms. The new standard will help reduce those harms and also reduce the disproportionate burden soot places on communities of color and low-income communities. The bill under discussion today would break the promise embodied in the Clean Air Act and would retreat from the best this country offers. Where the Clean Air Act offers vision, optimism, and the promise of justice, the bill is short-sighted, defeatist, and resigned to perpetuating inequity. The Clean Air Act is working. Pollution is down, the economy is up. The Clean Air Act has the fundamental premise that Americans have the right to safe, healthy air based solely on the science about the harmful effects of air pollution. Because everyone has the right to engage in ordinary outdoor activities without risking their health and well-being, we use this science to set national ambient air quality standards that must protect sensitive subpopulations like children and older adults. Then, after setting these science-based standards, we work to attain them in sensible, effective ways. The net result is that the Clean Air Act catalyzes innovation, and we benefit, both in terms of health and welfare and economically. The Clean Air Act has a proven record of producing and allowing for both pollution reductions and economic growth. Since 1970, when the modern Clean Air Act started operating, emissions of the air pollution regulated by standards have dropped by 78%. At the same time, our gross domestic product has tripled. Decade after decade, we've seen that good public health policy is also good economic policy. Decades of studies have shown that air pollution harms our health, and at its most extreme, leads to death. But air pollution also has acute effects that are felt daily by millions of Americans and can include missed work days and missed school days due to illness like asthma or COPD. Air pollution also affects our cognitive abilities. So it's no wonder that as air pollution decreases, productivity and economic growth increase. Air pollution not only chokes us, but it chokes our economy. Excuse me. For 54 years, the Clean Air Act has worked successfully to lessen that burden. At the same time, though, erroneous doom and gloom forecasts from industry have abounded. That pessimism conflicts with our country's actual experience, clean air standards sparking technological advancements, generating deep pollution reductions, along with strong economic growth. Earth Justice and others have explained the flaws in several recent attacks on EPA's new soot standard, as my written testimony and its attachments detail. Overall, the Clean Air Act is a great deal for our country. The benefits of the Clean Air Act significantly exceed the costs. We have substantially improved air quality, saved and bettered many people's lives, and in some, obtained a huge net benefit for our country. The bill under consideration should not be adopted. It would weaken the Clean Air Act radically without a single improvement, rob Americans of their 54-year right to healthy air based on medical science, and delay life-saving health standards already years overdue. I welcome your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Mr. Noe, you are recognized for 5 minutes for your opening statement.
Thank you. Chairman Carter and Ranking Member Tonko and distinguished members of the committee. My name's Paul Noe, and I'm here today on behalf of the American Forest and Paper Association and the American Wood Council. Thank you for the opportunity to speak about reforming EPA's air quality program. AF&PA represents manufacturers of sustainable paper products, and AWC represents manufacturers of structural wood products. These products are sourced from sustainably managed forests and made in America. Our industry employs about 925,000 hardworking Americans, producing 5% of our nation's GDP. And I'm proud to say our industry has already cut its greenhouse gas emissions by 24%, and we have a voluntary goal to cut them in half by 2030, consistent with President Biden's goal. Our members care deeply about the health and well-being of the communities in which we operate, and we'll continue the work to reduce harmful pollutants using the best technology. But there's no way to sugarcoat it. Our regulatory process is not working, and we need your help to fix it. Specific problems manufacturers face with the current NAAQS program include, first, outdated tools and policies that require facilities to use multiple worst-case assumptions and overstate a project's true impacts on air quality and cause permit gridlock. Second, a perpetual cycle of litigation-driven reviews creates massive regulatory uncertainty and massive investment uncertainty. And third, our regulatory system simply does not optimally address the most impactful emissions. Last week's PM NAAQS rule vividly demonstrates why common sense reforms are urgently needed. Under previous PM standards, our industry made substantial capital investments to modernize, and we made great environmental progress. But last week's PM NAAQS will no longer permit similarly beneficial projects. That's a lose-lose for our mills, for our employees, and the environment. Furthermore, affected communities won't truly benefit until EPA addresses 84% of the particulate matter that is left unaddressed by this rule. from other sources such as wildfires and road dust. Our mills account for less than 1% of the PM. We can't have progress on our nation's air quality objectives that's meaningful by simply focusing on the same stationary sources that have been regulated for decades under this program, especially when the permit program is so challenged and so unworkable. Let me be clear. This new PM standard is a perfect storm for permit gridlock, making it much harder to modernize facilities and to continue reducing emissions. EPA's rush to tighten this standard close to background levels and without a workable implementation plan has caused a tremendous gridlock. And the rulemaking also sets an unrealistic 60-day effective date, which sets a course for this gridlock to commence right away. It's very frustrating that EPA and the White House ignored concerns raised not only by industry, but by our partners in labor and many elected leaders from both parties. As a result, many current and future modernization projects are now at risk. So where do we go from here? The proposed legislation you are considering today would greatly improve the NAAQS program. We absolutely support a workable implementation plan when a standard is lowered so they can be successfully attained. Establishing a 10-year cycle to increase uncertainty and reduce wasteful litigation, and reforming the exceptional events program to prevent wildfires, which again is the largest source of particulate matter. We applaud the committee for putting this bill forward, but we also urge you to strengthen it to cover this PM NAAQS rule to ensure a workable implementation plan when it takes effect. We also think it's important to clarify what an acceptable implementation plan should include, to provide for realistic modeling that reflects where people actually live and work and the variability of emissions, and allowing exceptional events to be accounted for in modeling and permitting. Unfortunately, this rule's only the tip of the iceberg because we face an enormous cumulative regulatory challenge now. Many rules disregard evidence of unintended harms. If we don't change this trajectory now, we believe American jobs in many of your districts are at stake, and we stand ready to work with you to resolve this issue. Thank you for your consideration, and I want to express my great appreciation for Chair Rodgers' tireless leadership over 2 decades to support sustainable manufacturing in America. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Noe. Okay, we'll now begin questioning, and I want to recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Eunice, I'll start with you. Thank you for your testimony today. As you and I know, and as you shared with everyone, Georgia has one of the best air quality departments in the nation, and I appreciate you presenting your perspective on that today. You referenced in your statement that Georgia landed 2 of the largest economic development projects in state history in the last few years, and both of them are EV manufacturing plants. In fact, you also noted that one of them is in my district, the single largest economic development project in the history of our state. A $5.5 billion investment, creating over 8,100 jobs, probably that much more of an investment in ancillary businesses, probably that many more jobs in ancillary businesses. So obviously we're very excited about that. But in your testimony, it shows that industrial emissions are a relatively small portion of the emission profile, and a lot is background and other sources. This seems to miss the mark for improving air quality. Do you think that standards should be set that are attainable?
Absolutely, Mr. Chairman. I think that's one of the considerations that should be taken by the KSAC and that EPA should consider. In fact, Georgia's Division of Air Quality Director, Dr. Jim Boylan, formerly served on the Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee, and that's a point that he made in multiple discussions over his 6 years of service.
Well, let me ask you this. These 2 facilities that we referenced and that have been located in Georgia, would they have been located there under this recently finalized PM 2.5 standard?
So in my experience, when an economic prospect comes into Georgia and asks about specific locations that they would like to locate their facilities, the first thing they ask is this area in attainment with NAAQS or not? And if the answer is no, then that list, that option is very quickly stricken from their consideration, just because they know the hurdles they'll have to go through will be enormous.
So if these new standards for PM 2.5 are implemented, would they force the state to create compliance plans across all the economically active areas of the state, which constitute about 90% of the population, I believe you said? That's a large new burden for these communities, isn't it?
It would be, and I do want to clarify that some of these areas, after we do some additional modeling, may not end up being a non-attainment, but from our initial estimates, this is what this 90% of the population of our state would be impacted.
Good. All right. Thank you, Mr. Eunice. Mr. Noe, I'll go to you. As you know, we got a lot of paper mills in South Georgia.
Yes, sir.
In fact, my dad worked in a paper mill for 33 years and made sure that I worked there for 2 summers, and I couldn't get back to college quick enough, I'll tell you. You work on a broke beater in a paper mill, and it'll make you want to go back and study hard. So I appreciate your industry and everything that y'all do. But as you know, today we're examining this draft legislation and to modernize NACs and the standard-setting process. As part of that modernization effort, do you think we should look at providing more time for compliance in this draft bill?
Here's what we need, Mr. Chairman. The short answer is yes, but this is what's critical. We need a real-world workable implementation plan with the rule. We've got things ass backwards now. The rule comes out, it's tightened dramatically. We don't have a workable implementation plan. That's a recipe for permit gridlock, and we've been asking the agency for a decade to reform its broken air permit program.
You know, the proponents of this, of the new PM 2.5 standard, have said that industry always adapts. And to a certain extent, that's true, and we appreciate that. But is that really the case when the standard's getting so close to the background levels? I mean, you in your testimony said, you know, there's only so much you can do.
Well, here's the problem, okay? Because we have this broken permit program, projects are in jeopardy all across our country. The map that's behind you, the maps at page 17 of my testimony, shows that the country lights up. No longer do we have much green, which is go. You can go forward. We got a lot more red, non-attainment, but what is huge is the pink. And what that means is the standard is at 9, but average background in this country is 8. This is simple math. You typically need 3 micrograms, modeled micrograms, for a project to be approved. The math no longer works because you can only say 8 plus 1. If you're plus anything beyond 1, you're at grave risk that no project can happen. That map shows it in dramatic detail, and those black dots on that map are real permits that were approved at 12 that would be blocked at 9.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Noe, and thank all of you for being here. I'll yield back, and at this time recognize the ranking member, Mr. Tonko, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As I expressed earlier, it is critically important that these standards are based on the latest science to ensure they are health protective. However, I'm concerned that several provisions in the majority's proposal will undermine those efforts. For example, the proposal would change the 5-year review cycle to a 10-year cycle. Mr. Johnson, what would be the consequences of making that order of change?
Thank you, Representative. Well, scientists are continually studying the effects of air pollution, and sometimes even over the span of a few years, there can be significant new science that's developed. And we saw this with the soot standard, where studies from 2018 to 2021, just a 3-year period, strengthened the showing that historically marginalized communities, like low-income communities, are disproportionately burdened by soot pollution and its harmful effects. So frequent review of the standards is necessary to ensure that they keep up with the developing science, and this is especially important for communities that we are learning or confirming are especially harmed by air pollution.
And there can be a lot of science produced in a short period of time. For example, the 2020 ozone standard review included more than 1,700 new studies that were published in EPA's 2015 review of that standard. So, Mr. Johnson, if we are committed to having our environmental protections be based on the latest, best available science, would shifting to a 10-year review cycle undermine that goal?
Absolutely. It would undermine the goal because it would make it... EPA's reviews often run long, and if they're given more time, they would run longer, and the whole time that's happening, who would be left behind. It would be the people who are most harmed by the air pollution that they're breathing, and they wouldn't have stronger protections to keep them well.
Mr. Johnson, I would also like to ask you about the legislation's proposed changes to the Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee. Currently, the CASAC is statutorily required to have 7 members, with at least 1 from a state agency. What is the role of the CASAC today?
Sure. The role of the CASAC is hugely important. As I mentioned, this is, sort of a unique opportunity for regulators to engage with developing science. And it can be very fast-moving science. So it's really important, I think, to have, people who are really deeply immersed in it and who are focusing on what the standards role is, which is to say, this is what the science says is safe and healthy for people to breathe.
So would you say it's to inform EPA's consideration of the latest science when reviewing standards, or is it more focused on implementation and feasibility of standards?
CASAC's role in the standard setting process is integral. It's hugely important. That's what they focus on, and the standards are science and health-based. They do not and cannot and properly do not and should not take into account predictions of feasibility or attainability.
I know that states can have tremendous technical and scientific expertise, and I'm proud that a representative from New York's Department of Environmental Conservation is serving on that committee. So while it is important for states to have an ability to contribute to scientific reviews of standards, I also believe states are just one of several important contributors. Mr. Johnson, are you concerned that this proposed change to CASAC's membership might tip the balance of the committee?
Oh, absolutely. States do indeed have an important role to play as regulators, and they offer some expertise, certainly in science. But like I said, I think this is a very good opportunity it's important for the members of the Scientific Advisory Committee to be sort of fully immersed in the science that's going on, and the scientific research that's going on.
So some of these changes obviously are going to really change the approach as we've known it, and so I thank you for your responses. Mr. Chair, I thank you again for holding this hearing, but I do want to reiterate my serious concerns with this proposal, and with that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Palmer, for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank the chairman. Mr. Noe, what causes asthma?
I'm not a health expert.
Well, even the health
Congressman,
experts
but
don't know. But I just wanted to give you a chance to respond to that, because what we've seen since 1980 is a 60% reduction in emissions, despite the fact that the economy's grown over 700 and something percent. Vehicle miles driven's up 113%. Population's up 42%, I think. The issue here about air quality is a valid issue, but the fact of the matter is that we don't know what causes a lot of the respiratory illnesses, particularly asthma. What we have found is that people in lower income people who have poor housing, poor diets, poor access to health care are the ones where we've seen the predominant increase in asthma rates. So when you talk about, and you made a great point about this, the unbelievable economic damage that it imposes on people who don't have access to better paying jobs. And when they don't have access to better paying jobs, they can't afford better housing, they can't eat better, they don't have access to health care. And in many respects, what my colleagues across the aisle are advocating is really going to be more problematic for people who are struggling with these diseases. It doesn't make any sense. I look at what we've done just in reduction of particulate matter. I worked for 2 engineering companies, one of which combustion engineering and environmental systems, and we've made tremendous progress in reducing emissions, and particularly particulate matter. Yet asthma rates have continued to go up. So I want to raise the proposition here that as our economy has gotten better, and by the way, the economy is not necessarily a measure of GDP, because GDP is a measure of inputs, which is spending. And although my Democratic colleagues in the Biden administration want to keep talking about the economy's doing better, people are not doing better. The cost of living continues to go up. I think the market reflected that a couple of days ago when the stock market went into a tailspin when inflation was higher than unexpected. But I'd like for you to just talk a little bit more about what the burden that we're putting on business and the inability to provide high-paying jobs and better living conditions.
Yes, let me be clear, Congressman. We embrace the twin goals of the Clean Air Act to promote public health and the environment as well as the productive capacity of the nation. And I think the good news is we can do both. We have done both. We can continue to do both. But what we need is when a standard's lowered, we need an implementation plan that is based on the real world. We need a real world implementation plan that can work. Why do we need that? Because what we can't have is gridlock in the permit system where we can't modernize our facilities. Why is that important? It's not just for American jobs. It's not just for economic growth. It's not just for growing and reshoring manufacturing. Those projects make environmental progress. When you make a manufacturing facility more efficient, you not only reduce emissions of particulate matter, but you reduce greenhouse gases and every other emission. That's the win-win we need to get.
But that's what we've accomplished over the last 44 years.
Yes, sir.
Because we've been able to meet these standards, and the EPA has continued to increase the requirements, but we've always been able to meet them. One of my big problems with this is that about 25% of the air pollution over California, for instance, originated in China. We've had several people mention the wildfires. It's unreasonable, I think, to expect businesses to be responsible for meeting some of these standards because so much of what they're having to deal with was originated in Asia or from a wildfire.
That's why we say it's so important to have a real-world implementation plan. And that's why it's so important to look at the whole issue and be realistic about the things you're talking about, Congressman, like international transport of emissions, wildfires. The current program's not doing that. It doesn't make sense to me from a public health perspective to only look at 16% of PM emissions and ignore 84%. I personally don't see how that fulfills the agency's responsibility to protect public health. And it doesn't work very well. We're now at a point where the standards set close to average U.S. background, and our modernization projects that could reduce emissions as well as create high-paying American jobs are going to be gridlocked, and that's alarming.
I thank the gentleman for his response. I yield back.
The gentleman yields. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Colorado, Ms. DeGette.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. After the last questions, I have many thoughts and only 5 minutes. So let me see if I can put this in context. First of all, I have lived my entire life in Denver, Colorado. In the 1970s, the pollution from particulates was so bad in Denver, Colorado, you couldn't see the mountains on most days. And then the Clean Air Act was passed and implemented. And now in the wintertime, most days, it's crystal clear and beautiful. I urge everyone to come to Denver, and then you can go skiing up in the mountains, assuming we have snow. But that was as a result of the Clean Air Act. And the previous questioner, I don't think he meant to say this, but what I heard was an allegation that the Clean Air Act didn't really have health benefits, which is just not true from all the studies that you can read. A recent study showed that the annual benefits from cleaner air include up to 370,000 avoided premature deaths, 189,000 fewer hospital admissions, and also economic benefits of up to $3.8 trillion for the economy. And I see, Mr. Noy, you're nodding yes. And I think everybody in the business community would probably agree with that. I surely see in my own family and in my own constituents, asthma has really gone down because of the Clean Air Act. But unfortunately, that doesn't mean that we no longer need to have the Clean Air Act or that we need to no longer strengthen the Clean Air Act. Sadly, what's happening in Denver, Colorado right now, we fixed the particulate problem in the winter, but in the summer, now we have the ozone problem. And the last couple of years in Denver, Colorado, now we can't see the mountains in the summer because of ozone. A lot of that is because of population growth along the Front Range in Colorado and our geography. Some of it is due to wildfires in the western United States and in Canada, where the smoke comes down. I have never met one environmental regulator who thought that we should make businesses pay for what happened in wildfires. But what we do have to do is make sure that businesses are complying with environmental regulations so they're not adding to the natural problems that we have already. So I want to ask you, Mr. Johnson, about a couple of the provisions of this discussion draft, Section 2E in particular, which seems to me to undermine decades of the Clean Air Act and weaken air quality standards. The Clean Air Act requires a large, new, or expanding industrial facility to get an air pollution permit before starting construction. The facility has to commit to install pollution controls, and it has to demonstrate that its emissions won't produce unhealthy levels of air pollution in the area. If the facility's pollution would cause the area to violate an air pollution standard, then the facility has to do more to reduce or offset the emissions. But 2E of the draft law creates a loophole. If the EPA fails to meet the new procedural requirements, the proposal would allow the facility to get a permit by measuring its emissions against an outdated, less protective air quality standard. So some witnesses have referred to this as, quote, amnesty. I like it, Mr. Johnson, if you could just tell us briefly what the practical effect of allowing a new facility to be permitted under an outdated standard would be. How would existing facilities be impacted by such a change?
Well, I think, as Mr. Noe said before, that gets it ass backwards. It allows for air pollution problems to occur and then seeks to solve them rather than preventing them up front, which is what the Clean Air Act recognizes today as the cheaper, more efficient, better solution.
That's right. And another concern with Section 2E of the draft is that it assumes that it's a huge problem if EPA does not issue rules and guidance at the same time as a new air quality standard. Do you think it's always necessary for EPA to issue guidance at the same time EPA finalizes a revised standard?
There are cases where that's not necessary. For example, EPA's current PM implementation rule covers all future PM standards. There's nothing really necessary to do now. Right.
Thank you. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields. The chair now recognizes the chair of the entire committee, Ms. McMorris Rodgers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just taking off where we just ended, I guess I just don't agree with this idea that there's no issue guidance necessary. I met with a company yesterday who has 2 new plants that they'd like to move forward on. They've been working through the permitting process with this new rule. You know, they have 60 days to implement, and they have no way to implement because what is being proposed by the EPA is completely unattainable. There's no technology. We're not talking about saying we no longer support the Clean Air Act. We absolutely are committed to the Clean Air Act and making sure that it works for everyone and that America continues to have the best, cleanest air in the world, and we do, and we're committed to that. But we gotta do it in a way where it actually the standard setting process works, and that we can actually manufacture and build in America. You know, let's see. So last year we passed the the legislation funding microprocessing plants in the United States, billions of dollars. And I said at the time, I think we probably need to address the permitting. And I was told, oh no, permitting won't be a problem. And this year, they're wanting to come in, and not only are they saying permitting's a problem, they're saying they want to be exempted completely. Wouldn't everyone like to be exempted? We're not talking about exempting people completely. We're talking about a process that is broken, and we need to have a process that's going to work so that we can actually build and manufacture in America with and have the highest standards. So, Mr. Knoll, I'd like to start with you, Mr. Noe. Would you say the standard setting process is broken, and would you elaborate?
Here's the problem. When you lower a standard almost to background, and you don't have a workable permit program that's based on the real world, a realistic permit program, you're going to gridlock permits. Because the way the math works is quite simple, actually. The standard's at 9. Average U.S. background is 8. Headroom to get a permit has to be 8 plus something. And if it's anything over 1, you don't get the permit. The average headroom a permit needs for a significant project is 3. 8 plus 3 is more than 9. The project's not going to proceed in that circumstance. And this is a serious problem all around the country. And the map that was up before, that's on page 17 of my testimony, shows that the map lights up in pink. Bear in mind, those areas are in attainment, but they're so close to the standard, there's no headroom to get the permit. It's gridlock all over the country. And just to audit our own findings, we went back and looked at 28 real permits that went forward under the prior standard of 12. And we asked ourselves, well, what would happen if the standard were lowered to 9? Almost 80% of those projects fail. So this is what we mean, Chair Rodgers, when we talk about a permit gridlock crisis.
Thank you. As a follow-up, what percentage of emissions would industrial facilities represent typically?
All of industry is about 16% of the PM inventory. 84% is unaddressed by the rule. Our industry is 1%.
Thank you. What are the main sources of PM levels?
The main sources are sources unaddressed by the rule, such as wildfires, road dust, and other sources.
Mr. Eunice, we heard testimony last September that ratcheting down particulate matter standards makes reducing wildfire risk even harder. Will lower standards make it more difficult to manage wildfire risk?
The short answer is yes, Madam Chair, they absolutely will.
EPA has been notoriously uncertain and costly in approving prescribed burns and exceptional events, and there's always a threat of litigation. Would you agree we should make clear in the law that states shouldn't be punished for wildfire mitigation that will actually reduce wildfire damage and pollution?
Yes, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Needtrom, the way NAC's process is functioning risks offshoring of critical economic investments to places with awful environmental, labor, and human rights standards such as China. Would you agree?
I do agree with that. We are in a global battle for industrial investment. If those dollars don't end up in the U.S. with our high standards, they will be someplace with much lower protections.
Thank you. Should we have a standard-setting process that does not drive these economically vital investments away from the United States of America?
I absolutely agree with that, and I think taking considerations in addition to public health, like achievability and economic considerations, is a reasonable exercise.
I believe we can have both. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Schakowsky, for her 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would really label this draft legislation as the Soot Protection Act. And I am not happy about what I'm hearing from industry, because we are seeing at this time the greatest investment that we have seen in a long time in infrastructure and in construction and job creation right now in this administration. You know, I am very concerned about my city of Chicago, where up to two, up to 1 out of 3 children has been suffering from higher levels of asthma and other various breathing problems because of pollution in the communities. And we need to do something about this. And I don't think that's an either-or choice. I think we can have the kind of growth in our economy as well as protecting our families. So the EPA, let's talk about jobs. The EPA has estimated that this rule would prevent 290,000 jobs lost because workers not able to work because of the effects of the pollution. And it estimates that it will save $46 billion in healthcare costs by 2030. It seems to me that that's a fair trade-off. If there are some difficulties or some challenges, that we meet them in the corporate sector and that we make sure that we protect our people. So, Dr. Johnson, I just wanted to ask if you could discuss how this draft bill, the bill that we're considering today, which I am not in favor of, on what kind of effect it would have on, if you see that this would actually save enough children and enough people to make it worth doing.
Thanks. Just for the record, I'm not a doctor.
Did I say doctor?
I think you called me Dr. Johnson.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Do not want to have that responsibility.
Okay.
But I think this bill would jeopardize people's health and, well, their productivity in 2 big ways, both in the standard setting process and in the standard implementing process, which would jeopardize health tremendously.
So it seems to me that when we're talking about the creation of businesses, that we ought to be also considering the workers. And so if we have a better standard and making sure that those jobs are safer and cleaner, that would be a really positive outcome. And also, Mr. Johnson, I wondered if you could also talk about why it is important for the EPA to make sure that, let me see, if I could read properly. About low-income communities is what I really want to ask you about, because often those are the places that construction projects are put. It's easier to get a permit to go there. So why is it important for us to especially focus on low-income communities?
Soot is one of the more well-studied pollutants in terms of its disparate impacts, and those studies have established and well established that harmful health effects, especially death, resulting from soot pollution. And so I think, making sure that we are taking that into account and making sure that we put that first in our mind so that we can put people first is really important. And that will have benefits, substantial benefits for everybody, but especially for the people who have unfortunately borne the burden for far too long.
Thank you so much, and I yield back.
The gentlelady yields. The chair now recognizes the vice chair of this committee, the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Dr. Joyce.
First, I want to thank Chairman Carter and Ranking Member Tonka for holding today's important hearing on a legislative fix to EPA's proposed PM 2.5 rule, and for the witness for appearing with us. The National Ambient Air Quality Standard, NAAQS, setting process is broken. The evidence of this is in EPA's proposed PM 2.5 rule, which is unworkable for states and draconian for businesses. Sadly, this is all part of a worrying trend in the EPA of extreme regulations and government overreach. There is a misconception among many here in Washington that manufacturing is strictly based in urban centers. Yes, in South Central Pennsylvania, we produced coal, natural gas, agricultural goods, but in Pennsylvania's 13th congressional district, there is also a vibrant manufacturing section. In my district, that includes sectors such as steel, glass, aviation, aluminum, and paper. In these small towns, the manufacturers are the economic heartbeat of the communities. The paper industry is a great example of this, with companies like International Paper in Biglerville, like Nittany Paper in Mifflin County, and like American Eagle Paper Products in Blair County, each being integral and economical parts of the communities in which they reside. Sadly, PM 2.5 will make it harder for these industries to survive and harder to thrive. These companies have stayed in business by continuing to update and innovate their production of goods. American manufacturing today is the cleanest and the most efficient it has ever been. PM 2.5 will make it difficult to impossible for businesses in my district to adapt and modernize against international competition. The new complex permitting process that manufacturers will be forced to go through will scare away capital and it will scare away new investments. All of this under the guise of public health. For the record, I am a doctor, and I've practiced medicine for over 25 years. Caring about my constituents' health is not a political slogan. It is what I dedicated my life and my education to. And I can tell you from my personal experience, the way to improve healthy outcomes in a community is not to choke off economic development. It is to enforce and lift up the community regulators that overreach and take them away from the equation. It is to allow businesses to survive and businesses to thrive. The EPA needs to stop acting like it operates in a faulty vacuum and start to recognize that the real-world effects it has on American families. My first question is for you, Mr. Noe. Thank you for being here to represent the paper industry. As I mentioned, paper mills are critical to small towns throughout my district. How would PM 2.5 affect continued investment in them, their ability to modernize, and their long-term viability?
Here's the problem, Congressman, and thank you for the question. If EPA sets a standard close to background with a permit program that greatly overestimates the headroom needed for the permits, you have permit gridlock. Modernization projects can't proceed. What do I mean? Replacing older boilers, kilns, and furnaces with modern, efficient ones. Expanding lumber production to build new, affordable homes that sequester carbon. Repurposing a mill from making something like newsprint to sustainable packaging. This is where the Clean Air Act wanted us to be, which is where we can promote economic growth, we can promote high-paying jobs in America, and we can also make environmental progress. Because when you make these facilities more efficient using best controls, you make both economic and environmental progress. That's the win-win we need.
And that win-win, my friends on the other side of the aisle don't seem to recognize. They talk about situations where in past regulations, industry complains, but at the end of the day, they comply. From your view, what's different this time?
There's something very different right now, and it's very serious. And it's the basic issue I had explained where never before in history have NAAQS standards become so close to background. The PM NAAQS is literally 1 microgram from average background in the US. You tip for a significant project, you need 3, as I said before. So the permit can't proceed in that situation.
So with that narrow window, will industry be stifled?
Absolutely.
Within that narrow window, will jobs be lost?
Absolutely.
Within that narrow window, will my constituents not have the family-sustaining wages with health insurance that they are used to?
That's exactly the problem.
My time has expired, Mr. Chairman. I yield.
The gentleman yields. The chair now recognizes the ranking member of the full committee from New Jersey, Mr. Pallone, for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Every time EPA proposes a new policy, we hear this same litany of arguments over why it can't be done. These arguments rely on these exaggerated and unsupported claims about implementation costs, job losses, minimal health benefits. I mean, I've just heard these doomsday claims over and over again. It never stops. Mr. Johnson, what does the history of the Clean Air Act tell us about the relationship between environmental health and safety regulations and our economy, please?
It tells us that we can have both, and we do have both.
Now, one of the exaggerated, truly exaggerated, Republican claims being circulated about the new PM 2.5 standard is that the majority of counties around the nation will be in non-attainment. Of course, this conflicts with EPA's own analysis. Now, we have this map here. Most counties with monitors already meet the strengthened particle pollution standard. Look at the map. The overwhelming majority of the United States is in light green. These are counties with air monitors that already meet the more protective standards. So, Mr. Johnson, you mentioned this false Republican claim in your testimony. Can you expand on why their analysis is not realistic?
Sure. So the approach that was used in those maps is not the approach that EPA has ever taken to making designations under a PM standard. And indeed, EPA last week put out a memorandum that confirmed that it's not going to follow, does not intend to follow that approach, but rather would follow its historical approach, which is a careful, thoughtful approach that looks at a variety of factors and has never resulted in a map that looked like that.
So the National Association of Manufacturers released a report that, as you mentioned today, about the economic effects associated with the stronger PM 2.5 standard. True to form, the report paints a dark picture. Mr. Johnson, based on your Clean Air Act expertise, what do you think of their report and the potential economic impacts? I know you've commented on it already, but I'd like you to comment on the potential economic impacts, if you could.
Sure. I think it's important to note that the report doesn't even claim to say this is what will result economically from stronger standards. It says this is an amount that could be exposed to regulation. That is very different from saying that is job losses or economic growth or any sort of thing that will be lost. It's just a measure of exposure. And I think the report has also got some flaws. It assumes that there won't be any improvements in technological controls, and that's just not what we've seen historically. Part of the genius of the Clean Air Act is that it assumes, it predicts, it believes that our country, with innovative business and we can innovate. We can come up with solutions. And industry touts how innovative it is, yet they seem to doubt themselves in this circumstance. But what we've seen is predictions of doom and gloom routinely falsified by reality. In the late 70s, early 80s, the city of Houston argued that it could never, ever meet the 1979 ozone standard. It said it was impossible, unattainable. In 2013, it met it, and it's remained monitoring attainment ever since. So future predictions are not necessarily future realities. We can do better. We've shown that we do better.
Well, thank you. Since the beginning of the Clean Air Act, polluters have cried wolf every time EPA has issued a new rule to protect public health. They've claimed time and again that a new clean air rule will lead to economic ruin, but those claims just never come true. They're exaggerated, and once again, they're being used to justify this dangerous legislation that will leave communities exposed to the harmful impacts of air pollution. I want to say a long time ago, I was a freshman in college, and I came down to Washington, and I was working on the Clean Air Act. I think it was just, I don't know if it was just being adopted or whatever. And Nixon was the president. And most of the people, a lot of the people that were preaching that we needed the Clean Air Act and make it pass were Republicans, right? All very concerned about the environment. Contrary to what Mr. Nose said, the emphasis was not on the economic impact. The emphasis was on the pollution impact to save people's lives, to make sure we were breathing clean air. And I don't know how that got switched around. I don't know how the primary focus of my colleagues on the other side now is all about the economy and jobs. I'm not saying economy and jobs aren't important, but can't do anything if you can't breathe. And that still should be the primary focus, that we have to be able to breathe clean air. But thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Allen, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Chair Carter, for holding this important hearing on the National Ambient Air Quality Standards setting process. I think our witnesses today is of implementing air quality standards. We're looking at a discussion draft today to improve the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. Last year, we had a hearing on the proposed standards for fine particulate matter, PM 2.5, from the Biden Environmental Protection Agency. Recently, the Biden administration announced their final PM 2.5 standard, which will, as we're hearing, have devastating impacts on manufacturing. This announcement shows the need to improve the process for assessing air quality standards. Of course, Mr. No, you need to respond maybe to what was just said to you earlier, but you make a compelling argument in your testimony for sustainable regulation. In your testimony, you talk about many ways the current permit system is broken. Is that what the Clean Air Act was set up to do?
Not at all. The Clean Air Act, Congress was quite clear in the very beginning of the act. Congress said there's twin purposes to the act: to promote public health and air quality, as well as the productive capacity of the nation. And as I said before, the good news, no one's disagreeing with that on this panel. We're for both. The problem we've got now is because for the first time in history, the PM standard is so close to background, it's going to result in huge gridlock for projects that will both promote American jobs, which is why our workers were up here visiting with you all just weeks ago, but it's also going to allow for continued environmental progress, and not just on PM, but on greenhouse gases and every other emission. Yeah. Efficiency is that sweet spot where we can meet the twin purposes of the Clean Air Act. That's what we want to do. So you don't want unintended outcomes where you gum up the works for things that are a win-win for jobs and the environment. That's where we are.
Well, the permit process is a real problem in the country. I mean, we can't get pipelines permitted. It would we could power Europe and burn the air 42% cleaner, which would be good for all of us. How can the draft legislation get this process back on course for the people? What's this legislation going to do?
The legislation does some very needed things, and the first one is to say, when you lower a standard, the agency's responsible for developing a workable implementation plan. That's basic common sense. If they had done that, we wouldn't face this gridlock problem we're facing right now.
Okay.
And we've been asking them to reform this permit program for over a decade.
I know. And we just at an impasse on this. Mr. Eunice says we're looking at improving this process through legislation. One part of the discussion draft addresses improvements to Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee to require having 3 people from state air pollution control agencies on the board instead of just 1, which is the current standard. Can you share how expanding the number of people representing state air pollution control agencies on the board would be beneficial?
Yes, thank you, Congressman. So Georgia, for 6 years, had a representative on the Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee, and he was for a period of time, he was not the only air pollution control agency representative, but now there's currently just 1. And I feel like that perspective has gotten lost of what it's actually going to take to implement this standard at a state level and the burden that places on communities. Mm-hmm. And so I think having that additional voice would be beneficial.
Well, the EPA is supposed to operate under the principle of cooperative federalism. However, we've heard concerns from other state regulators in previous hearings that you and your colleagues are being treated as though you're just any other stakeholder. Where's the cooperation and why? What's the problem?
Yes, Congressman, there have been some challenges recently with some heavy-handed approaches from EPA into areas that have traditionally been handled by states.
Right.
And that is a
I
fact.
mean, do they treat you as a co-regulator, or they just ignore you too?
It's becoming more and more difficult.
Is it? Okay, thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Maryland, Representative Sarbanes, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here today. Since 1970, several key features of the Clean Air Act have helped make it one of the most successful environmental laws in the world. I mean, it really is a terrific piece of legislation, and it's created a very important framework. Its science-based health protective standards keep us moving towards our ultimate objective of healthy air for everyone. And cooperative federalism allows EPA to set clean air goals while states decide how best to achieve them. Mr. Johnson, is it important for EPA to have the ability to set strong, enforceable air quality standards? And do you think industry would meet these air quality standards voluntarily if they weren't sort of corralled a little bit?
I think that's vitally important. I think it's no coincidence that since the Clean Air Act was enacted to have those standards, air pollution has dropped. Before then, it wasn't.
Yeah, I agree. And the Clean Air Act recognizes that it usually costs less to pollute than to clean pollution up. Absent regulatory requirements, businesses generally don't control pollution. I mean, I get that. I understand that when they look at their costs. They may not necessarily step up in the way that they should. And we see almost every time EPA proposes a significant new requirement that business leans against it. Industry tells us it can't be done, that it'll cost too much, it'll turn off the lights, et cetera. But then they kind of get with the program and they work it out. We land in a place where business is able to continue to make the contributions we want to see from them and that they want to achieve. And at the same time, we can get to a higher standard in terms of clean air. So again, Mr. Johnson, have we found that the industry is somehow crumbles in the face of these standards, or are they able to meet those standards generally when they're brought to bear?
They're generally able to meet them, and the Clean Air Act recognizes that there may be difficulties and makes careful, limited exceptions for those circumstances where it's truly impossible or difficult. But the Clean Air Act recognizes that, people have the right to breathe clean air, and we are a country that solves problems, and we can do that, and it harnesses that energy.
Yeah, and I like that statement, we're a country that knows how to solve problems. I mean, we know from decades of experience that the Clean Air Act actually drives innovations in pollution controls. I mean, out-of-the-box thinking results from some of the pressure that is brought to bear. That becomes a new industry standard and takes us to a better place. And using regulatory standards to drive technological innovation is actually one of the hallmarks of the Clean Air Act, certainly when it comes to pollution controls, and we call these sometimes technology forcing standards, but that's a good thing. Once an air pollution standard is in place, American industry gets to work and meets the standard, and along the way, we develop more effective and less expensive pollution control technologies. So not only is our air cleaner, but we also end up exporting tens of billions of dollars of pollution control equipment all over the world, because as the rest of the globe is seeking to meet higher standards and clean up their air, they recognize that there's an innovative toolkit that we've created based on the standards that the EPA has set. Unfortunately, the discussion draft being considered today would inhibit EPA's ability to drive pollution control technology, undermining an approach that has been environmentally and economically successful for over 5 decades. And with this text, I fear that Republicans are putting polluters over people. I mean, that sounds like sloganeering, I guess, but I do worry that there's too much influence in this place and in a lot of places where laws are made by industry that that's leaning against these standards. And in the public's interest, we need to be pushing back on that, making sure that we're reaching for the next level. American families will pay the price for the kind of handout that I think this legislation establishes for some of these industries in terms of boosting their profits. And that's why I've opposed previous versions of it, and I continue to strongly oppose the proposal today. And with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Representative Weber, for 5 minutes of questioning.
I thank the gentleman, and irrespective of the term from the other side of the notwithstanding the sloganeering as it was termed going on next door, it sounds more to me like name calling. I remember that happening to me in the second or third grade, so I just want to get that out of the way. Mr. Eunice, I'm going to come to you first. Are we back on? The light's on. The light's on, but nobody's home. I'm going to come to you. My district along the Texas Gulf first. My district along the Texas Gulf Coast is the home of some of the largest refineries, petrochemical plants, and LNG facilities in the United States of America. Have you been to that district?
No, sir, I haven't.
How about you, Mr. Knuckles?
No, sir, I've not physically been there.
Mr. Johnson, you're next.
I don't believe so.
Mr. Noel?
No, sir.
Well, we want you to come there and spend lots of money. What the demand, let me just say, the EPA's new PM 2.5 standard will put that district into non-attainment. So, Mr. Netcom, the demand for the products produced there is only growing and only going to continue to grow. Are we back on? We're back on. As companies are looking to expand their capacity, and the world becomes our marketplace, quite frankly, which is good for American, and it's safe means safety for the world. How, in your opinion, how will this new standard impact the ability to operate and expand that very production in those areas that will now be in non-attainment?
Well, it's an interesting question, partly because of what the EPA's reg would do immediately. To Mr. Noe's point, setting the level at near background will make it nearly impossible to permit an expansion or a new facility. And what's interesting about this is that our energy security is really critical for this nation. And what we're seeing in the energy sector right now is a ton of innovation and a lot of dollars that are flowing into new technologies and new power sources. All of that will be stopped if we're not able to permit the industrial capacity that's needed to actually meet those demands.
Have you ever heard of wafting, where you have wafting of fires maybe over in Africa, or sand from the Sahara Desert, or from Mexico even coming up, pollution coming? Have you ever heard of wafting?
Yes, sir, or Canada, yes.
Do you think that's taken into consideration when the EPA imposes this kind of strict rule?
I think it should be. I think we need to be able to account for what is going on that is naturally occurring, rather than to put the entire burden of all PM sources on the backs of the manufacturing industry to address.
And is it your fear, as it is mine, that in essence what this will do is it will actually literally force companies to move their operations overseas?
That is a real concern of mine. As I noted before, we are in a global battle for industrial investment. The EU, China, and others went through exactly what we went through in COVID with disrupted supply chains, and they see the need to increase their manufacturing base. Others are coming for those manufacturing dollars, and we want to make sure they're here in the United States.
Yeah, all the while we are producing energy cleaner than any other country in the world. Would you agree with that?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Mr. Noel, I'm going to come to you. All across the country, there are communities that will be hit disproportionately hard by this new standard. These are communities whose very livelihoods are dependent on the manufacturing and industrial facilities that create jobs, contribute to the local economy, and improve the quality of life. We're talking about schools, we're talking about teachers, we're talking about students, we're talking about churches, talking about families. Can you speak to the health impact on these communities if these facilities are forced to shut down or leave, including, but not limited to, such as suicide, depression, and even drug abuse? Can you speak to those?
Congressman, I'm not a health expert, but I think everyone knows there's a body of literature out there on the very kinds of things you're talking about. And by the way, it grew significantly during the Great Recession. People realized they were actually underestimating those impacts and not fully appreciating them. And they also realized that this sort of argument of don't worry that those jobs are lost because one will be created somewhere else, that actually the transition and the loss of human capital, all that expertise that worker gained over their years of working in those facilities is lost. That's a terrible, terrible loss.
Takes quite a toll. Mr. Eunice, I want to come to you in the last time I have left. In your written testimony, you highlight the fact that the entire state of Georgia is in attainment under the previous PM 2.5 standards. Under the new standards, population 90% will now live in non-attainment areas. Texas is in a similar place. Can you speak to the challenges that produces for state regulators?
Yes, sir. So that will require that Georgia EPD start crafting state implementation plans for each of those regions that ultimately end up in non-attainment. These pages or these plans are hundreds of pages long. They require years worth of work on our end, and then ultimately EPA has to review to determine whether they agree or suggest changes to these plans. It's a very time-consuming, voluminous process. It will be a struggle for state agencies, given this new rule, to develop those plans and implement them.
And all the while, it seems to be a moving target. I yield back.
The gentleman yields. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from New York, Representative Clark, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I thank our ranking member in absentia for holding this hearing today. Good afternoon. And thank you to our witnesses for testifying today and for sharing their expertise on clean air and the necessity of strong standards. Mr. Johnson, in your testimony, you highlighted some serious concerns with this legislation that I share. One of my major concerns seems to be shared also by our ranking member, Tonko, which was indicated earlier by his line of questioning, relates to Section 2B, which changes the criteria for establishing an air quality standard from one that is based solely on protecting public health to one that includes a consideration of the, quote, likely attainability, end quote, of the standard. Mr. Johnson, in your opinion, is this phrase, quote, likely attainability, end quote, clearly defined?
No, it's not clear. Attainability might have many different meanings. In prior litigation, it's been focusing on background pollution, but even in that litigation, different parties have had different definitions of what constitutes background. So it's very unclear.
Well, thank you. We continue to hear from our Republican colleagues about the need to insert economic considerations into the statute. Mr. Johnson, do you believe that costs should be considered in the air quality standard setting process? And is there a more appropriate place for this consideration if you don't?
I do not believe that costs should be considered in the standard setting process. That's the way it's worked for the last 54 years. That's the way it's worked very successfully for the last 54 years. Where costs are appropriate to consider is in the implementation process. It's like going to the doctor. You want to know whether you're sick or not. You don't want to know how much it's going to cost. That's a separate question for later. So it's just not the right approach.
Thank you. Mr. Johnson, what would the implications of this change be on the standards EPA sets and the agency's ability to protect the air people breathe?
Well, it would be a ratchet against public health protections. And actually, we've talked about cooperative federalism before. It would be antithetical to cooperative federalism. Part of the genius of the Clean Air Act is it's catalyzing innovation. Another piece of the genius of the Clean Air Act is that it's putting states in charge of implementation by and large. And states can come up with their own approaches, and they can innovate too, and they can find new, more effective ways to come into compliance. And that's actually what's happened, as a number of states have explained in previous litigation. But by forcing EPA to consider so-called attainability, predictions of attainability up front, it sort of closes the door on that whole process. And so it actually would trample, and there are some other pieces of the bill that would trample on the state's ability to set their own approaches to come into compliance with healthy air.
Very well. And lastly, Mr. Johnson, if this legislation were enacted, how would this impact communities, especially those historically underserved?
It would have negative impacts on them. It would allow more air pollution to linger for longer and continue to make people sick, especially in those communities that are historically underserved.
Very well, and I certainly agree that this is a dangerous and harmful idea. This proposal has already been debated and rejected by the courts, and the EPA notes that it cannot consider the economic and technological feasibility of attaining ambient air quality standards, although such factors may be considered to a degree in the development of the state plans to implement the standards. Inserting costs into the standard-setting process will only serve industry. The American people will most certainly suffer, especially those communities that have for far too long disproportionately carried the burden of air pollution. And that is why I've opposed previous iterations of this language and why I oppose the discussion draft being considered today. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentlelady yields. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Representative Pfluger, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank the witnesses for being here. I represent the Permian Basin, and we are right now undergoing review from EPA regarding the consideration and the redesignation of ozone non-attainment. To kind of set the stage here, the Permian Basin is hundreds of thousands of square miles, and the EPA has recently disclosed that there are only two monitors for two air quality monitors for the purpose of redesignation. Both of them are in New Mexico, not a single one in Texas. So you kind of question the science a little bit here. I'll start with you, Mr. Natram. Talk to us a little bit about the impact of a non-attainment redesignation in the Permian Basin in an area like that, although it could be any producing area, on the development of energy regardless of sources. And I disagree with some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle on this particular point, but what cost does it have on Americans, specifically on the production of energy?
So there's actually a huge opportunity cost here, because what you're talking about is projects that will not get built. The Permian Basin is critical to our nation's energy security and puts us in a position to be a global leader in securing the world in meeting the energy needs of our allies. It's a national security issue as well. So to that, setting the NAC standards at background levels will make it impossible for us to further develop the Permian Basin and make sure we can continue to lead the world in energy security.
Well, let's talk about that national security implication there, and how would you fold that into the NAC's discussion and the way that they look at these things, because it's not just in a vacuum. I mean, the Permian Basin is the most prolific production area keeping this country, somewhat going right now.
That's right. So, I mean, we're seeing the live discussion right now as it relates to LNG exports. So our ability to export energy to our allies crowds out or stops them from having to rely on dirtier Russian gas and gas coming from China. That is the national security aspect here. If we're able to prop up our allies and make sure that they stay our allies and are not are not indebted to countries that don't have our best interest in mind.
I know this has been discussed, and thank you for that. But when we're looking at PM 2.5 and the ozone non-attainment designation, cross-border air pollution obviously is a factor. I think El Paso had this issue years ago on the very issue of designation. Yesterday, the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, TCEQ, sent a letter to this committee, and I think my colleague Mr. Weber was talking about this, with concerns about the NAC's process. Regarding cross-border pollutants, the letter states, and I quote, "Naturally occurring events such as Saharan dust, high winds, and wildfires, none of which TCEQ can control, all contribute to air quality in Texas and impact NAC's compliance. States with border cities also share a disproportionate air quality compliance burden due to the influence of emissions from Mexico, like El Paso recently." And I'll get back to the quotation. "Ringing diminishing air quality improvements only from those sources within a state's legal authority has its practical limits, and state implementation plans are approaching a moment of impossibility." Mr. Chair, without objection, I'd like to enter this letter from the TCEQ into the record.
Without objection.
So, Mr. Natram, does out-of-country pollution impact attainment?
Yes, sir.
Can you give us any previous examples of how EPA has correctly dealt with that and where we're headed at this point?
Certainly. Actually, I would defer to my colleague, Mr. Noe.
Mr. Noe?
There is a recognition by EPA that some of these other sources are very serious. In fact, when EPA issued the rule, they explicitly recognized that wildfires, for example, are a very serious public health threat. And they do have a rule on it, but to me, that just says they ought to endorse your legislation, because what the legislation would do is remove any legal uncertainty about whether that rule is adequate. And there are people concerned about whether it's adequate. So further legal clarity would help a lot there. Fires are 40% of our PM inventory. Wow. So this is a huge issue. If you want to protect public health, you've got to deal with that issue.
What would you say to the EPA regarding the only 2 sensors and on the New Mexico side trying to then designate the Permian Basin that largely exist in Texas?
We have to have a real-world permit program, and it's got to be based on real data and modern modeling tools. What they're using now is not even 20th century. We got to get into the 20th century with this program and then talk about the next.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Idaho, Representative Fulcher, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to the panel for being here. I've got forestry is a huge issue in Idaho, and it's a large industry, should be larger. But I've got a couple questions for Mr. No, but I just want to set up a brief statement for the record first. With this Air Quality Standards Implementation Act, I'm thankful for at least 2 aspects of that legislation. First, that the EPA must issue implementation regulations and guidance when it issues new standards or permitting reverts to the previous standard. That's critical for states like Idaho that are heavy on natural resources, but yet we have limited private land. Given our heavy footprint of federal land and where the DEQ must work with the EPA on air quality standards and things like sawmills, agriculture, specialized manufacturing, and even mining. So I'm thankful that that is in there. Also, I'm thankful that with this legislation language, states should have input in the review of potential air quality standards. And having the states be part of the scientific review on the front end could help both the states and the EPA, making for a more efficient process and less uncertain implementation. So with that, for Mr. No, your organization had mentioned back in September that needing a 2-year effective date to have time to prepare state implementation plans, with the EPA having a 60-day effective timeline but not issuing updated guidance to the states. Can you talk about the immediate impact on the forestry industry as a function of that?
Yeah, this is the irony. Our industry and it's a catch-22, frankly. Our industry tends to be in cleaner attainment areas, so there's been an EPA map shown that's all green. What's the problem here? Well, the problem is you can be in an attainment area, but so close to the background level that there's permit gridlock, and that's what our industry faces. 88% of pulp and paper mills are in areas like that where their projects are at grave risk, and 97% of wood products mills, there's some in your state, of course, face that. That's the problem, and that's a lose-lose for both the environment and for jobs.
So follow up on that. I'm not sure how familiar you are with Idaho, but just in general, you could answer or at least provide a perspective on this. With the finalized rule at PM 2.5, what do you anticipate the economic impact of that to be?
You know, frankly, Congressman, it's going to be severe, but the worst, hardest truth of it all is it's unknowable, because you never see the manufacturing facilities that are built. You never see the jobs not created. You never see the entrepreneurial ideas that are blocked by this red tape.
I understand, and that makes sense. Thank you.
I'll add
so
to you
all two,
for that.
Please, yeah.
For our industry, we think $3 to $4 billion impact for ours alone. And the more severe problem here, it's not about dollars, it's about what is this doing to our industrial policy. There's bipartisan agreement that we need to grow and reshore manufacturing jobs. The president says it, both Democrats and Republicans here say it, And the problem is what we have sideways with that, undermining that, are unsustainable regulations. We don't want no regulation. What we want are sustainable regulations that allow for both environmental and economic progress together. And where we are right now with this gridlock, that means all these projects that are going to make American industries competitive on the global scale and still make environmental progress, they're going to be stopped.
You're validating what's going on in my mind. And so thank you for sharing that and for your perspective. Follow up there. Many sawmills, obviously, in rural America, especially in my state. How does this legislation's extension of time from 5 to 10 years to review the NAAQS proposal to help prepare compliance operations and investments, what's good or bad?
Yes. I think there's been a lot of misunderstanding about that. There's absolutely nothing in that bill that would prevent EPA from lowering an act sooner than the 10-year cycle. That's what's mandatory. And the benefit of that, saying the agency can't be sued every 5 years if it doesn't see a reason to change, that's going to reduce litigation and business and regulatory uncertainty. But nothing prevents the agency, if it thinks the health science merits it, for whatever reason, they can lower an act sooner than that cycle.
Okay. Mr. No, thank you. Mr. Chairman, I'm out of time. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Ohio, Representative Balderson, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Questioning. Thank you all for your patience. Good afternoon, everyone. Mr. Neutron and Mr. No, the draft legislation we're considering today would extend the NAAQS review cycle from 5 years to 10 years. Can you discuss how this change would provide greater certainty for your industries and member companies? Mr. No, you may go first, please.
What it allows is for less wasteful litigation, which is great for lawyers. They make a ton of money off it, but litigation doesn't do anything for businesses making environmental progress, making themselves more competitive. That's my basic answer there. And again, nothing in that change would prevent the agency from lowering the NAAQS sooner if it wanted to.
Okay. Mr. Needham.
I agree with everything Mr. Noe said, but I would also note that in the manufacturing industry, we're making investments that last for decades. That planning cycle takes years to do. So extending the period from 5 years to 10 years gives you a greater period of certainty as you're trying to plan for an investment and calculate whether or not that new project can actually go forward.
Okay, thank you. Next questions for both of you again, and you can reverse switch order there. Your testimony states that many projects will never see the light of day on industry will be in the range of $3 to $4 billion. Can you discuss the impact this standard will have on small and medium businesses that are unable to afford such significant cost increases?
So I think there's two ways to approach that. One is the direct, immediate cost that small and medium-sized businesses would face from having to comply with a stricter standard. The other is looking at the integrated supply chain that we have in manufacturing. There are about 230,000 manufacturing firms in the U.S. Of those, 99% are small and medium-sized businesses. At some point, the cost of an expansion is shared throughout the supply chain. So what you're doing is really increasing the aggregate level of input costs that have to get pushed down to those small and medium-sized businesses at some point.
Thank you.
I'd only add that, again, there's this whole other cost that's a hard thing to think about, but it's the reality. It's unknowable because you never see what can't happen. There are so many projects that could promote both economic and environmental progress that will remain on the cutting room floor. Companies won't be able to go through this completely outdated, unrealistic permitting process, make the calculations, and there is, we can't go forward with the project, so it's canceled, and that's a terrible loss.
It is. Thank you. Can you both discuss how much industrial sources contribute to PM 2.5 concentrations, and would you say we are running into the law of diminishing returns for both of you?
Total industry, part of the inventory is about 16%. 84% of PM in this country is unaddressed by the rule. Our industry's 1%. We've been regulated under the NAAQS program writ large for over 50 years. For PM, it's been, since the late 90s for fine PM. But the point is, the agency keeps going back with the same tired approach. They're not stepping back and looking what Congress gave it. Congress actually gave EPA tools that are the ability to be much more innovative. Section 110 of the Act allows for very efficient emissions trading where they could do something about PM in a way that would provide much greater benefits and be much more cost effective.
Mr. Neatram? Hold on.
Again, I agree with all of that, but I would also note that as you regulate to background levels, one example we've already heard here is the $5 billion EV plant that was built in Georgia. That would actually not be allowed to move forward under the current standard, under a standard of 9. Its projections, as I understand it, it was modeled out to come in under 12, but over 9. That is the kind of thing that would not be allowed to happen here.
Okay. I have another question for you, and we're down to 30 seconds. Intel is currently investing billions of dollars to build semiconductor fabs in Licking County, in my congressional district that I represent. Given the scope and size of this project, the state of Ohio is currently investing significant funds to improve infrastructure in the surrounding community. How would EPA's proposal hurt this growth and potentially stall construction? And I'm going to ask you and save you the time. I'm going to just have someone send that answer in to us, please. I'm out of time. Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Dr. Ruiz, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, buddy. Mr. Chairman. Fine particulate pollution presents a significant life-threatening hazard to public health. Exposure to fine particles is linked with asthma attacks, chronic bronchitis, reduced lung capacity, respiratory illnesses, and potentially premature death. My district in particular has been identified as suffering from air quality deemed unhealthy. Over the past decade, much of my district has fallen under the non-attainment zone established by the Environmental Protection Agency, meaning that my district has exceeded the pollution limit set forth in the 2006 and the 2012 rules, either the 15 micrograms per cubic meters or the 12 micrograms per cubic meters, respectively. More specifically, Riverside County has one of the worst air qualities in the country. The American Lung Association has graded the county with an F grade for annual particle pollution. Additionally, the South Coast Air Quality Management District, highlighted at Coachella Valley, also located in my district, measured air quality of particulate matter at a 10 last year, and this 10 is a highly unsafe measure of an unsafe air to breathe. As it has been mentioned in this hearing today, the EPA established a final rule that looks to strengthen the nation's national ambient air quality standards for particulate matters from 12 micrograms per cubic meter to 9, meaning that there will be less harmful particles in the atmosphere and going into our systems, our blood systems. Exposure to fine particles can cause respiratory and cardiovascular illnesses. This new standard on particulate matter will enhance health safeguards for all communities exposed to such pollutants, as individuals will be exposed to a lower level of particulate matter exposure. More specifically, it will prevent 4,500 premature deaths, 800,000 cases of asthma symptoms, and 290,000 lost work days by 2032. Now, why are we here today? Because once again, instead of supporting EPA's work to tackle this problem with the immediacy it deserves, my Republican colleagues want to slow walk it, delaying action that could save lives. This is not the first time that they have attacked the implementation of EPA's new standard. In 2017, I watched my Republican colleagues and this very same subcommittee argue in favor of very similar legislation that delayed the implementation of ozone standards aimed at improving American lives. Mr. Johnson, Would keeping the previous PM 2.5 standard in place result in more negative health outcomes, especially for underserved communities?
Absolutely, and the Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee unanimously so found.
Okay. And, you know, as an emergency physician, I have witnessed firsthand the effects of elevated levels of hazardous fine particles, particularly on the most vulnerable members of our society, our children, the elderly, individuals with chronic and cardiovascular conditions, and those from low-income backgrounds. Mr. Johnson, what does EPA's new lowered PM 2.5 standard of 9 micrograms per cubic meter mean for public health for our most vulnerable members? And can you speak to the projected public health benefits of the stronger standard and how it can help this group in particular?
Yeah, I can speak at least somewhat to that, and if necessary, we can submit more. But EPA projects it will have huge health benefits, and you know, it will start to close the gap in some key disparate outcomes, including mortality rate for populations that historically have experienced much higher mortality due to PM pollution, and also exposure to PM pollution, which again is not evenly distributed.
You know, what's interesting is, you know, there's been some recent scientific articles published in pretty reputable medical journals that show that individuals who live in high polluted areas, whether by interstates or in very polluted urban centers, on average live 10 years less than than somebody who does not. And they do take into consideration all the potential co-founders that are involved. So this has a very serious health impact on our population. And the individuals who most likely live in high polluted areas are individuals who usually low income or minority populations that have been marginalized and have not had a potential say of saying, not in our yard, because they haven't had a voice to protect them in the political arena and in business and in this system. So that's why it's so important that we take their voice, their health, and the lives and livelihoods of individuals who are breathing these toxic airs into high consideration when we evaluate these. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Representative Obanoti, for 5 minutes of question.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses. Mr. Noe, I'd like to start with a question for you. So just as background, I represent a district that has the second most cement manufacturing in any district in the United States. And this proposed regulation would have a dire impact on that industry. It's estimated that if we were to raise the standards for PM 2.5 to 9 micrograms per cubic meter, that would result in required expenditure, capital expenditure of nearly $200 million for the cement industry, and another over $50 million in ongoing operation and maintenance every year. So obviously, those costs would have to be passed on to customers. And here's the question, because I want to talk about leakage. If my cement manufacturers pass that cost on to their customers, they compete in a global market for cement. That means higher prices, less competition in the global market. It might be then less expensive for people here in the United States who are undertaking a construction project to import cement from other places in the world rather than buy cement that is produced at higher expense here. But if that happens, then the emissions that result from the production of that cement will still occur. They'll just occur in other places of the world, which already have environmental standards laxer than our current standards. Right. So in my thinking, that leakage would actually result in a dirtier climate since we all share the same atmosphere. Do you agree with that analysis?
Yes, sir, and I would even add to what you said, which is the permit gridlock that this rule is going to create, because the standard's so close to background in so many areas, even in places that are technically in attainment, all right? That not only causes all the issues you just talked about, but American manufacturers have to maintain their competitiveness. We're in a global marketplace, so we have to be efficient. And the great thing about becoming more efficient is that's not only a win for jobs and the economy, it's a win for the environment, because when you become more efficient, you have less emissions. And so that's the frustration here, that in the name of protecting the environment, we're going to block continued progress. It makes no sense.
Yeah, I completely agree. Mr. Neitram, I want to continue that line of questioning with you because of the organization that you represent. Obviously, cement manufacturers either would have to comply with this and pass those costs along, or if they're unable to comply or unable to pass the costs along, in other words, if the market forces are such that they just can't sell cement at the higher price to keep themselves in business, they'll go out of business. And it's estimated industry-wide, nationwide, about 43% of cement plants are non-attainment, according to the new regulation. If those plants went out of business, how would that affect manufacturers' ability to expand capacity here in the United States?
Well, cement is such a key input into any kind of manufacturing growth that you're going to have. In any facility, you're going to have cement. And in fact, I would go beyond that and say, if those effects were to actually occur, it would frustrate the intent of Congress in passing the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. It would be next to impossible to actually update our infrastructure in the manner that you all have deemed appropriate. So it really is a self-inflicted wound here.
All right. Well, I see I'm going to run out of time here. Let me just make the point, though, in closing, that I think we have to be very mindful of unintended consequences here, as you have said. And one of the unintended consequences is that in imposing stricter regulations that require production to be shifted overseas, that actually makes the climate dirtier, not cleaner. But the other unintended consequences is that we lower prosperity and we increase hardship for everyone here in the United States. And that's why one of the things that the proposed bill that we're considering does is it requires that an economic analysis to be part of the environmental analysis. And I think that that's totally fair, because everything that we do is a trade-off between our impact on the planet and our need to exist as a human species. We can't exist without impacting the planet somewhat. And of course, we all want to be good stewards of the environment, and we all want to be as green as we possibly can, but we have to be reasonable. And I think that an analysis of that reasonability is a reasonable thing to do when we're talking about the impact of the bill. But I want to thank everyone for their testimony. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Iowa, Dr. Miller Meeks, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I also want to thank our witnesses for testifying in front of the committee today. As a physician, it never ceases to amaze me that in my lifetime, so I'm in my 6th decade of life, that the air is vastly cleaner than it was when I was growing up. Our waterways are vastly cleaner. You can actually fish and eat the fish that you get out of a waterway. We're not dying of overpopulation or acid rain or mercury poisoning. But yet, when we look at a prevalence of asthma, we say that's because of pollution. So obviously, if all the mitigation strategies we've put in place to this time haven't changed the prevalence of asthma, maybe it's not air pollution. Let's connect some of these dots, and you all can explain that to me on a different occasion. But the question is then posed, if there are no changes in health outcomes, if asthma continues to prevail, if the lifespan of people in certain communities continues to be at the level it is now, are you going to scale back the rule? Are you going to go from 9 to 12? And the answer to that will be no, you won't. Meanwhile, you'll have decimated manufacturing sector and farming sector in the United States, shifted it overseas, as my colleague Representative Obernolte said, and continue to have levels of particulate matter and pollution and dirty sources of energy rather than what we have in the United States. And as we've heard today, U.S. fine particulate matter standards, or PM 2.5, has been set at a level of 12 micrograms per cubic meter since 2012. Following the last statutory review of particulate matter completed in December 2020 under the Trump administration, they decided to retain the existing standards. However, the EPA's final rule published last week proposes to lower this level outside of the statutory review period to 9 micrograms per cubic meter. This committee hears me say this over and over again, but clearly the Department of Energy and EPA is not listening, so let me say it once more. The United States is a global leader in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, all while increasing energy production and making energy affordable. Since 2005, the U.S. has reduced net greenhouse gas emissions by 17%, all while primary energy production in this country increased by 48%. Further, the U.S. has reduced particulate matter 2.5 emissions by 42% since 2000. America's air quality also surpasses the rest of the world. U.S. levels of fine particulate matter are far lower than the world average and lower than Europe and Southeast Asia. On top of that, U.S. manufactured goods are 80% more carbon efficient than the world average. Mr. Yunus, if PM 2.5 level has been found safe by the EPA at 12 micrograms per cubic meter since 2012 for the last 14 years, can you tell me what alarming new research has come to rationalize why the Biden administration would rush to drastically lower the approved amount by 3 points outside of the regular statutory process?
It's a great question, Congressman, and Georgia EPD had a representative on the Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee when this standard was reevaluated in 2020, and our representative voted in favor of keeping the standard at 12 because he did not see any compelling scientific evidence of needing to lower the standard.
And what's the difference to public health in lowering the rate from 12 to 9?
Potentially significant, very significant.
Mr. Nettram, Mr. Noe, on the other end of that, what impact on manufacturing, especially in areas with heavy agricultural industries, how will they be impacted by the EPA drastically changing the level from 12 to 9 micrograms per cubic meter? And how will this limit innovation?
I'll go first. I'll be brief. It would be a tremendous negative impact on the manufacturing industry. Specifically, it would make it more difficult to expand an existing manufacturing facility or build a new manufacturing facility, preventing us from actually develop more innovative products and technologies.
Agree. I will just add that we have a map that's on page 17 of my testimony, and it shows your entire state of Iowa is lit up pink. What that means is the margin between the standard, which is 9, and the background, which on average in the U.S. is 8, is so close that there's serious risk of permit gridlock for modernizing any facility in your entire state, in your district. We took one project that was a real project that went forward under the prior standard at 12 and saw that that would have been blocked under 9, and that's a black dot in the state of Iowa.
Yeah, it's safe to say that the unintended or perhaps the intended consequence would be shifting manufacturing and agriculture from the U.S. and increase air pollution and greenhouse gas emissions globally. My time's expired, and with that, I yield back.
The gentlelady yields. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Crenshaw, for 5 minutes of question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here. For the 3 people listening on C-SPAN, this is, well, let's try and summarize what's going on here. So nobody disputes that the Clean Air Act is a good thing. It's massively reduced air pollutants in America. We've seen 70% reduction in pollution across the United States. We have the very clean air compared to the rest of the world. And associated with that authority is the EPA's ability to continue to reassess air quality standards, which then cause states to have to implement programs that determine whether or not certain projects are permitted. And what you really find interesting about this is the projects that we're talking about are really only 16% of the actual emissions. That's been brought up multiple times throughout this hearing. And those are, stationary emitters, things like manufacturers, power plants, things that produce all of the stuff that we need. And any reasonable person can look at this and say, there's a logical conclusion to a point where we reach increasing marginal costs and decreasing marginal benefits. And you might argue that we're about at that point, especially if you compare, say, our standards to our European friends who are often hailed as, the environmentalist heroes. And so now the EPA wants to reduce the standard from 12 to 9 particulates per million or per cubic meter. And so now we have to assess what the costs of that are going to be. And the environmentalists say there's not going to be any costs. There's never any costs, right? One more regulation, just one more, just 3 more, just 10 more. because the last one was good, so 10 more must be better. That's always the logic. But it can't possibly be true. There's always a marginal benefit decrease, which is, I think, what we're seeing, this diminishing returns, especially when you're talking about harming 16% of the actual pollutants and not even talking about, 40-something%, which is wildfires. I find it interesting that, we look at the map of which counties in America are out of compliance, and California is bright red. Why is that? Likely wildfires, a lot of agriculture in that part of California. And so that means that they cannot as easily permit new power production facilities. What state in America is having the biggest problems with power production and the highest prices, highest increases in electricity prices? California. Maybe because they're having a hard time actually building things. And so those costs just aren't taken into account. And that's a huge, huge problem. We went over before some of the permits that would have been revoked recently if this standard had been in place. And these permits are for things like steel manufacturers, power production plants, aluminum manufacturing, EV battery manufacturing, cement manufacturing. Last I checked, all of these things are essential to a green energy revolution. You want to mine more copper? Well, it's going to have some emissions to it. But you also need a lot of copper and a lot of steel if you want to build hundreds of miles worth of transmission lines to get your green energy to your urban centers. Nobody's thinking about that at the EPA, and that's a real problem. And apparently they don't want EV batteries made either. They want them made in China, but God forbid we actually do some of that processing here under our better standards and have a better global benefit. So, Mr. Nittram, can you discuss the diminishing environmental returns when we're placing more prohibitions on manufacturing the way we are?
Certainly, and Congressman, I think you framed it exactly right. If you look at emissions as a pie chart, industrial emissions are the smallest sliver of that. 84% of all emissions come from naturally occurring sources, which are outside of manufacturers' control. But the EPA's proposal would actually impact permitting of those industrial sources. So you're putting the burden of addressing all of the 100% of 100% of PM emissions on that 16% of industry, on industry, which accounts for only 16% of that. And the diminishing returns are really significant. And as you noted, we are a global outlier now, right? The EU standard right now is 25. They will get to 10 over years. The UK has an aspirational standard of 10 by 2040. They'll get to 10 in over a decade. We are putting ourselves in a box in which it's going to be nearly impossible to build those new investments. It's not just semiconductors and batteries and EVs. It's everything that goes along with that. If you want to have EVs on the road, well, we're going to need more power capacity, more transmission lines. There's going to be a need for much, much more infrastructure around if you want to transition the economy.
Right. Thank you. I'm out of time. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Anybody else? That's it? Okay. I ask unanimous consent to insert in record the documents included on the staff hearing documents list. Without objection, that'll be the order. I remind members that they have 10 business days to submit questions for the record, and I ask the witnesses to respond to the questions promptly. Thank all of you for being here. Very productive, very informative meeting. Without objection, the subcommittee is adjourned.
Seth, it was good to meet you. Glad to hear you favor the expansion of the Good Neighbor Plan's trading provisions to large and paper industry.